One of the most exciting things with the release of Switch 2 this month, for me personally, has been the update of original Switch games. Not just the backwards compatibility, mind you, but actual patches. Things that improve the graphics. And there's quite a few of them. Nintendo has been surprisingly generous given their track record in the past with re-releasing games. And the results are honestly awesome. So of course we wanted to look through them. This includes some of the Zelda games, the top-down ones, some of the Mario titles, and more. And Oliver, Mackenzie here, has also been doing a lot of testing on this, and I think we're going to talk about it today.
Yes, John, I did some of the legwork today on these titles, but I'm pretty sure we both have a lot to say about them. I think there's some pretty compelling upgrades in the mix here.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and go through these, starting with one of the games I think that I absolutely loved, but was limited by technical problems. So The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, the remake, and then last year's The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. Both of these were made using the same core technology, but both of them exhibit one major fault on the Switch. Having covered these originally, I think it was very clear. Essentially, they try to run at 60 frames per second, and they often fail, especially when transitioning between areas, and it seems to be somewhat double buffered, meaning that every time the frame rate drops, it goes from 60 down to 30, and you're kind of bouncing between these two, making for a very rough experience. I think anyone that's played it can attest to this. So of course I was excited to see how they would perform on Switch. Oliver, what's the verdict?
Yeah, so these two games were really excellent titles that looked good, I would say, on original Switch hardware.
Yeah.
It's just that poor
Great
performance.
Yes.
So you had that really inconsistent profile with that double buffer VSync setup that you mentioned. You get these pretty wild swings, basically. Anytime they were over budget from 16.67 milliseconds, they go immediately to 33.33 and they kind of stick there for a long time.
Yep.
So, yeah, that was, you basically get the sensation of going from 60 to 30 to 60 to 30 and back again. And I would say this is a bad issue in Link's Awakening, but it's not like, it's something that you could overcome and stomach through.
Yeah.
But for me, at least in Echoes of Wisdom, it was really intense. You spend a lot of that game at 30 FPS. So yeah, you covered these games initially, John. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts, but this is like, these are some games, two games on original Switch hardware, one of very few titles on original Switch hardware that I set aside and I said, I'm going to wait for an upgraded console because I don't want to play these games in their current state.
Yeah, I actually did that with Echoes of Wisdom. I love Link's Awakening so much that I did play through the whole thing originally. And there was no hope of a new Switch anytime soon when those originally released, right? Or when Link's Awakening came out. So I was just like, this is what it is. This was one of the games I played back on Game Boy. One of the games I had back on the Game Boy back in the 90s when it came out, of course. So seeing it remade in this way, I loved it. But yeah, the performance wasn't great in spots in the overworld, but I felt like dungeons in some areas of the overworld were largely okay. And that's why Echoes of Wisdom was kind of a bummer, because pretty much the entire open world area runs like garbage. And by that I mean it's mostly 30 FPS with random jumps to 60, making it feel wildly inconsistent in a way that I found extremely off-putting during actual gameplay, and it got worse the further you played. So I also just had to put it down and hope for the best. And my hope was like it would just run better on the Switch 2. I didn't actually think they would go back and do what they've done here, because the first thing, obviously, yes, spoilers, it does fix the frame rate. The frame rate is now perfect. It's 60 FPS locked. It's 100% exactly what I originally wanted. Just even coming out of those various buildings, it never drops. The swamp area in Link's Awakening, it's perfect now. Everything I saw in the game so far is exactly what I wanted, and that alone was exciting. But there's actually a lot more to it than just the performance, right?
That's correct. They do hit a locked 60 FPS, which is quite impressive. On top of that improvement, they both look much more refined. So I would say that in both games docked, in interiors, they looked okay. They were kind of near 1080p, I would say, in terms of resolution.
Sure.
But in the outdoor environments, you're getting something closer to 720p, and they looked pretty rough in both titles. And now we're going from about 720p in those open world environments to something about 1620p, I counted, something in that range, which is about 4 times the raw pixel count, which greatly improves the overall fidelity of these games. And I think the artwork scales really beautifully to those high resolutions
Really
as
well.
Yeah, it feels like the games were designed under, to hold up under the scrutiny of high-res rendering. And here you're just seeing all that additional detail brought out. There are some minor changes as well, which people might like or dislike or whatever, but they are changes that I noticed here. The depth of field is a little bit deeper and less pronounced. So that means you get less background blur, less that tilt shift effect, which is presumably an artifact of that resolution change. So you see the environment around you a bit more clearly. Again, you could see that as a good thing. You could see that as a bad thing. That's just a slight artistic change that comes about as a result of the resolution difference. There's still some pretty obvious aliasing in areas of the image that are blurred from that depth of field. And the SSAO flickers quite a bit in motion. It would be really nice here if we had like some TAA or DLSS to clean that up, but maybe I'm asking too much here. The SSAO also looks a little bit different, a little bit more defined. It has a little bit of a different kind of outline to things. Looks a little bit different, but not necessarily worse. And then in handheld mode, I wanted to go over that quickly. We're going from typical resolutions around 576p in the original version to a full 1080p in all the shots that I counted, all that I tested. So flat 1080p looks really good in the Switch 2's panel. Again, that's about 4 times the pixel count. It's pretty impressive. Like docked mode, it does seem to come in at pretty much a locked 60 FPS as well. So overall with these games, these are 2 games that really were not in great shape on the original Switch hardware, I have to say. On Switch 2, they're comprehensively improved, and I have no caveats about recommending these titles to anyone, handheld, docked, whatever. As long as you have a Switch 2, they're fantastic experiences.
Yeah, it's borderline like a free remaster is what it feels like.
Yeah, absolutely.
It genuinely feels like something that they could have released for a price, and I'm glad they didn't though. So that's really great. But let's move on. So that's one huge success then. The next one, I might argue, scales even better in some ways, specifically because of how it used to work. So I'm talking about Super Mario Odyssey, one of the earliest games for the Switch. I also covered this back in the day. This was an awesome looking game, and I think it was one of those games that really pushed the Switch pretty hard because it was a large open Mario game that ran at 60 frames per second, both in docked and handheld modes. We'll talk more about the handheld stuff briefly, but the thing about the handheld mode that confused me so much at the time when I first discovered it was the weird resolution setup, where in handheld mode it actually ran using interlacing. So, but sort of like horizontal interlacing. So it was like 640 by 720 resolution. So it kind of like jittered between the 2 frames to get the effect of 720p. But you could tell when moving that it was essentially losing resolution, right? Because you're only getting half the data per frame. But still, you could see that they were throwing everything they could at this game to get to 60 FPS, and they did it. But now, this too has received a pretty gigantic upgrade.
Yeah, so before, I thought these games were pretty good performers, looked pretty good on original Switch hardware, but obviously there were some deficits, as John brought up. And now in docked mode, at least, you're going from about a dynamic 900p in the original title to a dynamic 1800p, which again, 4 times the pixels. 4 times the pixels. Twice the vertical resolution, twice the horizontal resolution, but of course that means 4 times the total amount of pixels. And it genuinely looks quite solid on a 4K display. There is some dynamic res in there, but for the most part it's at or near 1800p. It's still a little bit aliased, of course. There's no TAA or DLSS or anything like that, but it looks quite sharp. The HUD is a mix of 1080p and high resolution assets. Basically, the artwork in the HUD is 1080p typically, and the text is high resolution here. So basically there you see that the bitmaps just don't scale perfectly to that high resolution. I also noticed that all the game's button iconography from Switch 1, that's all still here. So all the tutorials will have like Switch 1 Joy-Cons in them. You won't see any Switch 2 controller photography in there, obviously, because they've not swapped out those assets. The performance is great too. So I have some footage here. The original game on Switch 1 was mostly 60, but as you noted in the original coverage in New Donk City in the Metro Kingdom, it could drop a little bit in this opening section. It could have some frame rate drops and stutter a little bit here. Maybe it was CPU bound to some degree because you have a big environment, lots of entities, things like this. Now that all plays back at a lock 60 FPS. So that's great. Handheld, you had that weird interlaced resolution setup, which Actually, in some of these stills that I'm showing on screen here, looks all right, but as soon as you move the camera here, you'll notice that it kind of falls apart a little bit in a really conspicuous way because you're only really getting half of 720p. So again, here we're going from half of 720p basically to a full 1080p here in my counts. So again, you're maxing out the Switch 2's display. I think you're going to hear that a lot here with respect to that portable mode, with respect to handheld mode. But yeah, overall here, nice improvement. Not a game that really demanded a big improvement necessarily, but a big improvement has been delivered here regardless, and it looks a lot better.
Actually, and there's even one more point to add to that, and this was especially noticeable in New Donk City, is that the original used decimated animation for anything at a certain distance from the camera. So like you mentioned in the Pokemon coverage, right? So like, you know, a lot of them were just 2D sprites, but there's also the polygon characters. But after a certain distance, they would essentially update at half rate and then at like quarter rate. So all the pedestrians walking around looked super choppy in the original. Now everything updates at 60 frames per second all the time, no matter how far away it is from the camera, which makes the whole thing just look a lot more coherent in motion as well. So another cool benefit that suggests that they had a lot more CPU headroom this time to sort of handle this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, I do want to take a quick aside because this actually kind of applies to all of them. HDR, right? People are probably going to say like, oh, what about HDR? Because HDR technically was added to these games, right? Like that is kind of part of the spec. So already with these first two, and I think you're going to agree with me on this, Oliver, what it looks like to my eyes is if you just sort of take an SDR game and put it into an HDR container, but then sort of tone map everything up to make it kind of brighter.
Yes.
As opposed to actually implementing the full range. Now, I understand that doing so, it's an LDR game. It's originally made for the Switch 1, and it's not trivial to add that. And we don't know what like the rendering pipeline looked like originally, to if that's even possible to map it out well. But there's ways to do HDR sort of in the post, if you will, that looks really good. And I don't really think that's what we're seeing here. It's not bad. It doesn't look bad to the eye. You're just not getting that actual dynamic range, right? And I think this is absolutely true in the Zelda games. It's true in Mario as well.
Yeah.
And kind of going forward in most of the titles, as far as I know.
Yes. So HDR support is funny here. Basically, it looks like they're running in some kind of HDR container, but without really proper tone mapping to my eyes, or at least as proper as like audio HDR can be. Because in my experience, I have a really, really bright monitor, right? It's a BenQ monitor. I like bright. I have it pretty, 80% brightness, pretty bright, right? So it goes to like 1500 nits max. So for me in an HDR game, when I have the brightness turned up like that, in a game like Fast Fusion or Mario Kart, again, I'm not saying that those are like, maybe Mario Kart's HDR isn't the best, but at least it gives me that brightness, right? And here, it's kind of a flat image. It's very washed out. It just looks like, in a lot of instances, when you have like a PS5 game that isn't made for HDR, but you have it forcing HDR on. But the problem for me is that I actually don't have HDR forced on in my console settings. I have HDR turned on for compatible software only, but these are reading as compatible software. Right? So that's the part that I disagree with, because to me, I'd much rather have these games in SDR. To change that, I have to change that basically per game to turn off my HDR, because these read as compatible software. They shouldn't read as compatible software, except for New Super Mario Bros. U and Splatoon 3, which only display in SDR. So you boot these games, run them, and even when you have that HDR for compatible software only toggle turned on, they will boot in SDR. The whole system will be in SDR. So those games actually, I think, do present this properly. And I think this is actually the right way to go about it. When you have software that wasn't designed for HDR, or at least was not, tone mapped properly from SDR to HDR with like a good tone map, and you're satisfied with that result, I think this is a better outcome than getting these games washed out on Switch 2.
There's also an alternative, and this is actually what I was thinking of. So, and this is also still annoying. On LG sets, like I'm using the G4 back there.
Right.
It has obviously the option for HDIG, which is what I would prefer for any sort of native HDR application. But you're right. When using HDIG with these games, they look very dim, like the PS5 dashboard, basically. If you turn on a dynamic tone mapping, however, specifically for these games, you actually do get a much higher brightness than you would in just normal HDR. And it is very punchy. The problem, though, is that it's just like punchy across the board, which
Right.
it's not. It's weird because these are very bright, cartoony games, right? So, like, at in some sense, like, I actually like how that looks to a degree, but you're also not really getting the true benefits of an HDR output. So it's just kind of a lackluster implementation in most of these games. But actually, we're going to get to an interesting one next. And we've already talked about some of the biggest improvements so far, but now that I think about it, this next one is one that is arguably among the largest, I would say, just given like all the changes that they've made here. It's Splatoon 3, right?
Yes, there's some really exciting improvements here, headlined by some image quality changes. So we're going from on the original Switch, we're going from a dynamic 1080p resolution to a dynamic 4K resolution on Switch 2 in docked mode. So that's a big improvement. It's a full 4K image, again, 4 times 300 pixels, and it does seem to run at 2160p a large majority of the time.
A lot.
Yeah, including this shot where Switch 1 is at 864p, Switch 2 is at 2160p. So that's a gigantic multiple in terms of resolution, like 5-6 times the resolution.
Exactly. It's huge.
Yeah. The HUD is interesting here. It's a mix of 1080p and 4K. There are some bitmaps in there, but also some like vectorized elements. So those scale nicely. Like the text here scales nicely. So that image quality improvement is huge. Again, there's no AA here of any kind, but it does hold up very well in a 4K set. You get that perfect pixel match. Performance is interesting here, and I think this is part of what you're indicating with your earlier comments, because the original game ran its city hub sections at 30 FPS. So maybe because because of CPU demands, or maybe because these areas are a little bit more intense graphically, a little bit more complex. They wanted more freedom to design them.
This has been consistent across the whole series, by the way.
Right.
Even going back to the Wii U game, like the city areas, all the hub stuff that you're always spending time in between matches and such, you're always at 30.
Yes. Yeah. So here on Switch 2, those areas run at a full 60 FPS, and the rest of the game, I played some matches, it runs at a full 60 FPS as well, so that's a nice upgrade. Then there's portable mode, which is a little bit less exciting, I think only because Splatoon 3 already looked and played so well on Switch 1, because it was like 720p 60, some dynamic res in there, but generally looked terrific, played terrific. That's how I played the majority of my time in Splatoon 3, certainly. And here, it's basically a locked 1080p from what I can tell, and obviously 60 FPS. And of course, that change in the city area also applies to portable mode. So you get that 60 FPS update throughout the game, a reasonable upgrade in portable mode. But I kind of think that, they've got a 1080p panel. There's only so much they can do to upgrade this game. So 1080p, 60 FPS, I think that's a pretty good level of performance. And presumably, hopefully, you get a little bit longer battery life than if they had like super sampled it or something. So that's probably a good choice there.
I will say, though, thinking about it, in portable mode, I still kind of prefer the way the game looks on the Switch OLED, because you get the better contrast of the OLED screen, and you don't get the response time blur of the Switch 2 screen. So it just and because in this game you're constantly rotating the camera a lot, so there's plenty of blur that occurs. Yeah. So it's kind of better on the Switch OLED, but only in that portable mode. Everything else docked, which is how I normally would play anyway, feels like a gigantic improvement. Like you said, often 5 to 6 times the pixel count. It's really, really impressive all around, and a big upgrade that almost, so like it's wild, because in a way, like Splatoon 2 kind of felt like an adaptation of Splatoon 1 in a way,
right,
from the Wii U, but then like as a full price game. I mean, there was new stuff in it, but Splatoon 3, this upgrade genuinely feels like it could have been like a paid remaster, in the same way that like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was, a re-release of Mario Kart 8, right?
Right.
It feels like that, but maybe even a larger jump in some ways. Next up, though, we are not done with Mazzer, as they call him in the UK, Super Mario. It's time for Super Mario 3D World. And this is now the third generation of Super Mario 3D World. We have gone from the Wii U to the Nintendo Switch, where it already got a pretty significant upgrade from 720p 60 in, well, there was no docked, in Wii U mode, up to 1080p 60 in docked on the Switch 1.
Uh-huh.
But there was a big caveat for this game. It looked great on Switch 1, but then they added a whole new section area, sort of like a separate game, right? Where similar to what I actually covered last time with Sonic and Shadow Generations, where you had Shadow Generations, this game has Bowser's Fury, which is almost like its own standalone game. It's a bit short, but it's a very ambitious and interesting take on the 3D Mario formula. Problem is, if you played it in portable mode, it ran at 30 frames per second. And even in docked mode, it was not 100% stable 60. So it was clearly pushing the Switch pretty hard. So I was very excited to see what we would get on the Switch 2, and the results are pretty darn impressive, wouldn't you say?
That's a very good outline of the game's Switch 1 performance for sure. But yeah, I think that in general here, docked mode, starting out with docked mode in 3D World, right? We're going from a dynamic 1080p on Switch 1 to something that looks like 1800p, possibly with dynamic res, I'm not quite sure, but 1800p-ish is where I'm counting in here on Switch 2, which does look a lot better. It's a pretty soft game. There's a lot of like depth of field and stuff like that, but it does look pretty good here.
I agree.
In terms of the UI presentation, some is vector, some is bitmap, so it scales, it's like 50-50 basically in terms of scaling well to this high resolution. And then performance is a locked 60 FPS here as it was before. Portable mode is generally 720p 60 on Switch 1 and 1080p 60 on Switch 2, again, in this 3D World content. And of course, the primary limitation there probably is not the Switch 2's GPU, just the resolution in which they can deliver content on Switch 2, which is, not quite scaling with that increase in GPU grunt, although that's perfectly fine.
I would also interject one thing. Super Mario 3D World is actually a fairly slow Mario game. And as such, more so than some of the other games, this one actually does look pretty good on the Switch 2 LCD, I would say. It doesn't move fast enough to the point where the blur becomes an issue, essentially. So it's still pretty attractive on that hardware. I do like playing it in portable mode. But obviously, Bowser's Fury, I think, is the more interesting part, right?
Bowser's Fury is definitely more interesting. So in docked mode, even, this was quite a lot harder on the hardware. So it was targeting 60 FPS here, but it was often running at or around like 720p, those kind of resolutions I counted a lot in my analysis here. On Switch 2, it goes to a dynamic 1800p. Now, there is more dynamic res here in the mix, like I was counting shots around like 1656p at moments, but it is counting in that kind of 1800p, slightly below range very often here. I also did notice some differences in shadow map resolution, some improvements in shadow map resolution on Switch 2, which I think you can see in this shadow here. And then, like John mentioned, the game could dip a little bit during like those Bowser's Fury segments where Bowser is raining down hellfire and all this nonsense. And on Switch 2, that is running at 60 FPS locked. And then handheld mode is even more interesting. So this ran at 720p, kind of like its docked mode counterpart on Switch 1, but it ran at just 30 FPS. So here on Switch 2, we go from 720p to 1080p and 30 FPS to 60 FPS. So it runs a lot better. It's a lot more satisfying in handheld mode on Switch 2. It's a really, really big improvement. In this mode in particular, it's like a huge improvement. And yeah, it looks substantially better, plays a lot better. That mode in particular is a real standout on Switch 2 that basically eliminates all the compromises we originally saw in the game on the original Switch unit.
Exactly. And I would say in docked mode, image quality is very much on par with Knack 2 on the PlayStation 4 Professional. So for all you Knack 2 fans out there, you know what to do. All right. Moving on. There's just two more games to discuss here. And these are perhaps a little bit less ambitious.
Yes.
It's Captain Todd, Treasure Tracker, as I like to say, and New Super Mario Brothers U.
That's correct.
And so let's see. So New Super Mario Brothers. Well, actually, let's start with Captain Todd because he is a captain after all. Okay. This one, man, I haven't played this for a long time, and I haven't sampled this at all on the Switch 2 yet. So this one is entirely for you.
Yes, Captain Toad, a little odd here. So dock mode, we're going from 1080p to 1440p, which is not that much of an improvement. It does look better, but it also weirdly looks a little bit smoother and possibly even a little bit softer. And I think what they're doing here is they are actually applying some post-process anti-aliasing to the image as well. That's what it appears to be here for me. So you're getting a higher resolution image that is smoother with less obvious aliasing artifacts on Switch 2, as opposed to the kind of chunkier, kind of crispier Switch 1 look. Performance remains at 60 FPS. Portable mode seems to go from 720p to 1080p here, again at 60 FPS, so that's pretty decent. But in handheld mode, we don't really notice a similar difference in the kind of edge presentation or anti-aliasing or lack thereof between the two portable systems here. And then there's also New Super Mario Bros. U, which is pretty simple, I would say here, although not like they did what they could with it, but it's a pretty simple upgrade. So before it was 1080p docked, now it's 4K, full 4K. Before it was 720p portable, and now it's 1080p, and it's 60 FPS all around. But I would say that the overall art style here, like John has made mention of in a couple pieces, isn't 100% to my liking. It looks very generic, very flat, very smoothly shaded. It's not exciting in the same way that like a Super Mario Brothers Wonder art style is, or like a Mario Kart World
right, sure.
kind of art style is. It's not exciting in those ways. And I would say that the backgrounds here, the 2D backgrounds, are clearly designed with 1080p in mind. And some of that artwork, even though you're sampling it at a much higher resolution, it really was designed for 1080p. The resolution is in line with what you'd expect for 1080p. So some of those background elements really don't scale in the way that you might like here. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, John. It's like on paper it looks really good, but in practice, it's like, well, it's not really what you're looking for necessarily.
I mean, fundamentally, a lot of the background elements have the same problem as the HUD stuff, right? They're bitmaps. It's not actually polygon graphics necessarily, or it's just like textured that way. So you're not going to get that much benefit from going to 4K. This is one of those examples where I feel like super sampling would have been better. Just, output it at 1080p, but super sample from a higher res. So you match everything at 1080p, but you clean up any sort of edge on it. And this game was actually also 1080p back on the Wii U where it started. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this one in the end. I actually covered this game and kind of slagged it off pretty hard in the Super Mario Wonder video I did, really highlighting my problem with it, which is the way they do sort of like key poses and animation frames of Mario's actions. He looks very limp in these games. Like he doesn't feel that great to move around, versus like Wonder, where they very specifically chose exact keyframes for like hitting blocks, landing on enemies, things to make it feel very impactful, like the old Sprite games, where here it feels like a limp polygon character that never really moved that well. And also, I always felt the Mario Brothers U games, or sorry, the new Super Mario Brothers games always had this kind of heavy, weighty feel that felt like it was trying to like take a page from like the 3D Mario games in 2D, but I don't think it works that well in 2D. So, but hey, if you like these games, please, by all means, enjoy it. You can now enjoy it at a higher resolution, which is cool. I guess what would have been cool, I mean, I don't know how possible it would have been, but in a case like this, it feels like they absolutely would have had the headroom to get this up to 120 frames per second. I'm actually a little surprised that none of Nintendo's releases so far have attempted that. Like with some of the more conservative games, I feel like they could have. I mean, these are Switch 1 games, so there is a challenge there, but I feel like Nintendo would have wanted to demonstrate 120 frames per second benefits, and using a lower spec game like this would have been a great reason to do so. So
I did test 120 hertz output specifically in all the software. All the software I've tested on Switch 2 so far, and none of these games kick you into that 120 hertz mode when you have the toggle on. So yeah, there's no option for like a 40 FPS mode or 120 FPS mode, nothing like that. That would have been cool for NSMBU for sure.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, overall then, it's an interesting amount, and I would say nearly every game, actually every one of these is a really nice upgrade. I think Nintendo did an awesome job releasing these for free. It's actually, like I said at the beginning, somewhat uncharacteristic of Nintendo to do this, and it sort of represents a new era for them. So I'm really happy to see it. And most of the upgrades are pretty significant. And in some cases, it actually like fixes the game. I think the two top-down Zelda games are the best example of actually solving major technical flaws the original games exhibited. Those flaws are gone, which is excellent. But what about you? I mean, what's your overall thoughts? You sound pretty impressed as well.
Overall, I think these upgrades are great here. I think they're very solid. They're nice enhancements of the Switch 1 versions. And like you said, they're free. So people were giving Nintendo flack for the paid upgrade for the Zelda titles, for Tears of the Kingdom, for Breath of the Wild. And perhaps they should get a little bit of flack for that. But at the same time here, what we're getting here is huge upgrades to a lot of these titles in terms of resolution, in terms of frame rate. Very, very satisfying upgrades for free. So no content enhancements necessarily, no new content, no new art or anything like that. But for the most part, really, really good looking versions of these titles. So I think the biggest upgrade though maybe was in the Scarlet and Violet patch that I covered last week, that we broke it into its own video because it was so special, and that game is so near and dear to my heart, certainly. But I believe that's the most substantial upgrade of the bunch. And of course those Switch 2 editions of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and in the future Mario Party Jamboree and Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Yeah, those are coming up as well. Those are Switch 2 editions as opposed to game upgrades, but we'll have to look at those in time as well. But when you move to Switch 2 here, we're seeing consistently across the board more stable frame rates, every game at 60 FPS, 4 times the pixel count in most games, sometimes even higher than that in some titles. Resolutions between 1440p and 4K in docked play, consistently resolutions at 1080p portable, which is about as good as you can expect there. And I think it's a really good way to sell people on Switch 2, especially if you're coming from some of these games and you haven't played them as much on Switch 1. I feel like this is a great opportunity to play them on Switch 2. And then also one other thing that we have not discussed up until this point, which is loading times. So loading times, as you can see in these tests, are quite a bit faster on Switch 2, at least in the software that I've sampled here. We're looking at a pretty big improvement in Mario Odyssey here, and more than a 2 times speed up in Bowser's Fury. These loading times are a lot faster than their Switch 1 counterparts, and I don't really think you'll be bothered at all by loading times on Switch 2, whereas they were a little bit more of an issue in Switch 1 software on the Switch 1, could be a little bit more annoying. So I also think this is a good validation of the system's capabilities, because it does have the grunt to put out really high-res imagery, native 4K imagery even, just in simpler titles. So if you're looking at that Switch 1 software, Switch 2 can consistently deliver it at like 1800p 60, 4K 60, these kinds of resolutions often. So that's very satisfying. And that's very capable for like this little tiny 20-watt kind of quasi-handheld machine with this tiny fan, tiny heatsink assembly. That's very cool. So I do think this is a great way to get more mileage out of these games. Like I said in the introduction, I'm probably going to play a fair bit of those Grezzo Legend of Zelda titles. I think those are a lot better on Switch 2, certainly. This is a really compelling set of upgrades. Nintendo has done a great job here just bringing these games up to the standard that we probably expect from a Switch 2 running these kinds of titles. And I think this is a great excuse for anyone with any kind of interest in these games to go back and enjoy these games, whether that's for the first time, whether you're replaying, whether you're coming back after an initially unsatisfying experience like me with Echoes of Wisdom or John with Echoes of Wisdom. I think this is a great opportunity to get more mileage out of your Switch 2 with just vastly upgraded versions of these Switch 1 titles.
Agreed. So yeah, we're off to a good start. I guess the only curiosity now I have is whether we're going to see additional upgrades for other games, right? Like there's Kirby Star Allies, which could definitely benefit, but I think the big one I think everybody wants is Xenoblade games. All 3 of them, or 4. Wait, yeah, 3 of them. Wait, no, there's 4 if you count Torna, I guess.
Yeah,
it's kind of its thing. But either way, those games they definitely had some issues with regards to image quality, and if you recall, there was even something about 60 FPS found in the somewhere in there, the configuration
for XCX,
files for X. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is actually 4. There's 1, 2, 3, the remaster of 1, then there's Torna, and then there's X. So there's like 5. Man, there's so much Xenoblade on the Switch. It's nuts. It's wild. I like it. I would like to see those upgraded. I would like to see Pikmin 4 upgraded, because that was one that actually ran at quite a lower resolution since they switched to Unreal Engine. Another one I would love to see. I remember complaining about Paper Mario: Thousand Year Door. It's a really nice looking remake, but it was capped at 30 FPS, right? Which was a downgrade from the GameCube version. 60 FPS would be nice. None of this stuff I think we know is necessarily going to happen, but it's all like wishful thinking. Is there any others you can think of?
Oh yeah, for me, Mario and Luigi Brothership would be one. Kind of inconsistent frame pacing.
Yeah, that was pretty messed up.
Yeah, that was I think there was a bit of a problem towards the end of the Switch One's life cycle, where you had like some big like second party titles that came in that were not in very good shape on Switch One.
No, you're right.
I'd also say another example would be Princess Peach Showtime. Good platformer, but inconsistent frame pacing, Unreal Engine.
30 FPS tops.
30 FPS, exactly. So that's not very satisfying to me. I could say some other ones, like I'd love to see, you know, Mario Kart 8 at 4K. That would be pretty cool. There are lots of other titles here that are kind of like nice to haves, and a couple I think probably aren't realistic, like Tokyo Mirage Sessions would be kind of cool at high resolutions. I don't think anyone's going to back to that one.
No, probably not.
Yeah, but in general, I think they've tackled some of the more important titles to get out of the way. But I would say that I think there is some hope for the future here in terms of getting more of these game upgrades, because Splatoon 3 was not part of the initial round of titles that Nintendo had announced. They announced it alongside the upcoming Splatoon Raiders game. And then they released it the next day. So Nintendo has indeed, post-launch, even if only by a few days, they've announced and released new upgrades. So I'm fully expecting, and I hope that my expectations will be satisfied here, I'm fully expecting they will be announcing more games like this in due course. Perhaps if they do like a Nintendo Direct in July, like as has been speculated, perhaps they will announce and release, maybe even shadow drop, some new releases like these, some new updates to hopefully enhance more of their Switch One library, because yeah, there are a lot of great Switch One games. Nintendo has a vast first party and second party library on Switch One. I'd love to see more games like that brought over to Switch 2 in enhanced form.
Agreed. But I think that's going to do it for this video. So of course, thanks as always, Oliver.
Likewise, John, it was a pleasure.
And thank you, viewers, for watching. And hopefully you can see from this how that we're actually super happy with what Nintendo's done on this. So hats off to them for a job well done. And yeah, hopefully we'll see more upgrades of this quality. But that's going to do it for this video. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.